Information manipulation affects all areas of our lives. Massive disinformation campaigns are being launched, fake news, trolls, and bots flood the info space. How do various forces use the modern information environment? What can we do to counter anti-democratic tendencies in an environment full of propaganda that efficiently masks itself as credible information? In today's discussion, I'll be asking our experts on these topics.
You are listening to the podcast of Political Capital Institute.
My name is Dorka Takácsy, and I'm co-hosting this podcast with Péter, Krekó, Director of Political Capital Institute. I have the pleasure to greet Peter Pomerantsev, the renowned British journalist, senior fellow at the London School of Economics, and the author of the best-selling books Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and This is Not Propaganda. He came to Budapest to the invitation of the British Embassy and Political Capital for a public event we had this week on the 25th of February. So Peter, in your works you explored in depth how propaganda and the manipulation of reality works. What would you call the biggest threat to liberal democracies in the next decade? Will they make it to then, at least?
Well, look, I'm biased, I work in a very specific field, in a very narrow field, but maybe in that narrow field you can see reflections of much bigger crises. But, you use the term liberal democracy there, and, there's a lot of very good political scientists who will tell you at length about, the implicit tendencies and tensions between liberalism and democracy and how they're tearing each other apart. But one of the ways we've always balanced, what the masses want and freedoms, which don't always go hand in hand, is through having some sort of ideal of public debate and deliberation, which smooths somehow all these different tensions which are implicit in democracy. And, people have talked in rather abstract ways about things like the public sphere, and there's lots of debate about is it one public sphere or public spheres, or is it really an oblong or some sort of hole? But in any case, we had a bunch of cultural norms and methodologies and assumptions about how we manage that kind of conversation in society. And it kind of rested on a few axioms, which I think we all took for granted, about what is a democratic information space. So things like the idea of a free market of ideas, that eventually the best ideas would come to the top and the best information would come to the top. That pluralism would make debate better. A certain idea of the free individual who expresses himself, and that's associated with emancipation. And kind of an idea, an assumption that we had a kind of like an unspoken, what I've heard called an epistemic constitution, that you could win with the better arguments and evidence, and that the power was scared of the truth. And these were kind of things through which we squared liberalism and democracy and different opinions and somehow managed not to kill each other. Now, all those things are coming apart. All those assumptions are coming apart. It's completely unclear whether in an era where you can create disinformation at such huge scale as you can on the internet, whether the free market of ideas works. We've seen pluralism tip over into factionalism and polarization, where common dialogue breaks down and everybody has their own sense of the facts and their own facts. So you can't have a debate really anymore. We see a new generation of leaders across the world who aren't scared of the truth. They don't care if they're caught out lying, which makes the whole profession of journalism highly suspect. And I could go on. So really, we had a bunch of assumptions, which I don't think we even questioned for a long time. And they've all been blown to smithereens. Whether that means the end of liberal democracy, I don't know. But certainly in the thing that I think about, which is media and propaganda and the public whole, the public sphere, then we really have to go back to the drawing board.
Some says that the new information technology and its further development, and especially artificial intelligence, will make all these things even worse. For example, via the deep fakes and the even more automatization of the production and the spread of fake news and disinformation. Do you think that we will see an even more efficient spread of disinformation? So should we prepare for even worse, or the logic of that you have just explained remains pretty much the same, and the technological challenge can be countered with other kinds of technology?
So you just used the word disinformation, which is, I think is a very important one to define with a little more precision. So there's, I think, 3 types of disinformation. I'm not the only person to think about it this way. There's a lot of thinking around this. Some refer to an ABC of disinformation. So you're talking about one type, which is content. Yeah? Deepfakes are the latest great fear. There's actually no evidence yet of them being used in any politicized context at all. But how useful is that? We've always had untrue content. That's not a new thing. Also, take something like the Russian campaign in America in the 2016 elections. Most of the content was not true or false. It was like, go Hillary or go Trump or Hillary's an evil person. Only a certain amount of it was actually lies. It was just supporting, amplifying, sowing prejudice, but it wasn't actually lying, the content. So that's content, and I don't think that's a new thing at all. Then we can think of disinformation in terms of behavior. So that is the use of bots, trolls, search engine optimization to boost content, but also to a huge scale. That's new. The fact that you can, in a second, create hundreds of thousands of fake accounts, which will look like real accounts, which will seem as if they are Bob in Milwaukee, when actually it's Ivan in St. Petersburg. And you can do it en masse as a campaign. That's new. And that's deceptive behavior, because the people looking at that don't understand who's behind it. And they're the kind of deceptive actors. So, GRU pretending to be Guccifer or something. So I think if we focus on behavior, that's what's new on the internet. And that's what we need to think about. How do we regulate that? Is it okay for troll farms to exist? I don't think it is. I think anonymity for an individual is fine. There's actually no problem if someone says, I'm anonymous online, this is a satirical account, or I'm anonymous online because of my safety. I mean, that's often necessary for security. As long as the person who's reading it understands, okay, this is an anonymized account, and therefore understands the context. The problem is these mass coordinated campaigns which are happening, and an infrastructure of the internet where we don't understand why an algorithm shows us one thing and not another. So we don't even understand how the means of production kind of happen on the internet. So I think that's where we have to think about disinformation. I think battling with individual pieces of content is A, impossible, and B, probably goes against human rights. But also, look, who cares if one person online is saying that, I don't know, is saying that, I'm trying to find an example that isn't partisan, is saying that the earth is flat. What's a problem is there's a campaign of millions of fake accounts saying this. Then it's a problem. So that's what we need to target.
So an ever-present theme in your books seems to be the disinformation architecture, whereas on the state level we can talk about non-attributability, and on the personal level is this deniability thing, which is simply present on every level. What do you think about these denial strategies?
Attribution is actually very, very complicated online. It's very, very... So even with a lot of the sort of the work that the Internet Research Agency did in St. Petersburg, so researchers could kind of make an estimate, judging by their use of language, the timing of the distribution of the content. They could make a guess that this was coming from St. Petersburg, but the only people who really knew it were the platforms. And until the platforms, Twitter and Facebook, started releasing their own data, could the Mueller investigation kind of say this was being done from St. Petersburg. So attribution is incredibly hard. It gets more and more difficult because the ways of disguising it become more and more sophisticated for many reasons. And that kind of just furthers the sense of kind of, the sense of murk that we all have on the internet. And, the aim of a lot of campaigns these days is not to convince, but to kind of seed doubt, confusion, lack of trust. We can talk about why that's happening, but that's kind of a motif that we see everywhere in different countries, but a lot in Russia, but we see it in a lot of places. And that adds to it. That adds to that sense of we don't quite know what's going on. Look, there's a huge, much bigger thing that we need to confront here, which is, on the one hand, we have less censorship than ever before. Yeah, on the one hand, there's even a closed country like China, which has a firewall, even they can't really control content in the way the Soviets could in the Cold War. So in a sense, we have much less censorship than before. And certainly in these kind of soft authoritarian countries that you see, throughout Southern Europe and the Middle East and Latin America. So on the one hand, you have more information than ever before. On the other hand, we actually have no idea about how that information is created. We're kind of surrounded by this weird kind of internet weather, not really understanding what's behind it. We don't understand if something is organic or artificial. We don't understand why it's being targeted at us. We don't understand who's behind it. We don't understand how our own data is being used to target us. We don't understand if I'm being told one thing, what is my neighbor being told? So the old media system in democracies, which was very faulty, but at least you could try to work out what was going on because you knew who owned a newspaper. You could work out what their aims were. You as a citizen had some sort of chance to negotiate this kind of world. Now you don't. And it doesn't matter how intelligent you are. You just don't know. You don't know when you're looking at a website whether it was created yesterday or a year ago, and so on and so forth. So we live in a new kind of censorship. And that needs to change because I don't think we can start critically appraising the information around us until that changes. And that means a lot of things. I think, that means making troll factories illegal, essentially. I think that sort of behavior has to become illegal with quite serious sanctions attached to it. By the way, according to the terms of reference of the companies, it already is illegal. They just don't do anything and there's no cost to it. But I think it'll also mean changing the transparency of algorithms. I think it'll also mean understanding how our own data is being used in order to target us. So I'd like to see a radically more transparent internet where that kind of sense of murk and darkness and distrust is dispelled. Because that sense is almost the aim of the campaigns. I mean, we don't know what the Russians really wanted out of their campaign in America. But at the end of the day, they're very interested in spreading that sense of uncertainty and trust and darkness.
Moving the shift of the discussion a bit towards Russia and Vladimir Putin's regime. In your first book, Nothing is True, Everything is Possible, and even your paper together with Michael Weiss, The Menace of Unreality, you introduce a very important term, postmodern dictatorship, which seems to well describe the contemporary nature of disinformation in the sense that it does not really want to push through one big narrative, but rather variability of narratives and an abundance of narratives in order to confuse the audience. What do you think citizens and pro-democracy activists living in so-called postmodern dictatorships, or like Russia, or softer versions like postmodern authoritarian regimes, like what we can increasingly see in Hungary, what would you recommend to the citizens who want to rebuild trust in some kind of narratives, just in terms of information policy? What do you think can be the way out of this cynicism that you have just described?
So, I don't know how useful the term postmodern is now. It was a fun term to use at Russia, the Russia that I was describing, which is a slightly different Russia to the one we have now, which is increasingly just dictatorial, I think. I mean, they're not, it's changed. It's
not even postmodern anymore.
Yeah. What was that? Tim Snyder's line, post-truth is pre-fascism. We can overuse that term, though what's clear is that they gleefully, or the people in the establishment who thought about propaganda, have leapt onto the tropes of postmodern philosophy, or what John Rawls would call bad relativism. I mean, actually, like sort of philosophers knew right from the start that this could be misused in order to undermine the idea that there is any truth out there, so therefore you can't argue with us. It's kind of the logic. I mean, the head of Россия сегодня, probably Russia's most famous propagandist, Dmitry Kiselyov, told his assembled journalists when he took hold of one of the largest news agencies in Russia, there is no such thing as objective truth. It's a myth imposed upon us, which is when they were like going, we don't want to lie. They're like, it doesn't exist. And apparently the Chinese propagandists have been quoting Foucault recently in their statements. Again, it suits a lot. Human rights is just a Western construct, therefore your human rights are not our human rights. I think we see these kind of arguments, which we knew more from kind of left postmodernism. I think I've heard them here in Hungary even, that, this is just, there are no universal values. Everything, knowledge is always a subset of power, therefore all knowledge is relative, therefore we don't need your truth and human rights here. I think most postmodern philosophers would be appalled by this misuse of what they said. I don't think this is a natural development of it. I just think this is like, it's been used. And we do see that, we do see various versions of that in different places. But you're quite right. The key term here is trust, and how do we think about what is sort of, an evidence-based conversation going forward? Because this is what this is really about. I mean, if you take away the idea of kind of facts and objective reality and evidence from the political discourse, then all you're left with is just kind of fear, emotions, and kind of a weird, dark world that you need a strong man to guide you through. So Sean Hannity in America is very good at this. Sean Hannity is sort of Trump's favorite propagandist. No, but if you listen to him, he's very, very good. He deconstructs what he calls the fake objectivity of CBS and NBC, and said this is all fake objectivity. But he doesn't say that we're going to have a new objectivity. He says, therefore, all that's left is like to be as subjective and opinionated as possible. What they call as objectivity is actually just pro-Democrat, anti-Trump bias, which is what we hear used against the BBC these days as well. So it's a very dangerous place. They're getting rid of objectivity and evidence in order just to replace it with just this wild identity, emotional stuff. So how do you return it? So we have to think about what are the conditions under which a factual discussion emerges again. And in the research we've done, and I think other people have done as well, often the moment you start talking about the future, not about identities, which are always going to be subjective, and where it's always very hard to kind of operate with facts, the moment you start talking about a practical, concrete future, the more grounded the discussion becomes. So we've seen that in work that we've done in Ukraine, in other places. I think other people have seen it as well. And I think it's not a coincidence that what Putin, well, I'm not going to say Orban, because you can tell me about Orban, but Putin, Trump, Duterte, a large part of the Brexiteers, Bolsonaro, all have in common is that they're nostalgists. Yeah? They're trying to get away from a concrete, fact-driven discussion about the future. So the more, I think, future-generated discussions, practical ones, tend to be more factual because you need evidence to prove that you're doing something, how you're going to get there. You see elements of this in the Democratic debate in America. I'm watching the primary, sort of like the really rational guys like Buttigieg and Warren. They're constantly trying to bring the conversation back to the future. When we talk about the future, then we need facts to show how we're going to get to this future. Nostalgia, you don't really need facts when you're doing nostalgia. So I think there's that connection between a practical future, and I don't mean kind of a super utopian future, I mean like the next 4 years future, and a factual discourse. I mean, we don't have a post-truth discourse when we're building a bridge. The moment we're building a bridge, people want to see the plans, they want to see the evidence, people become very, very grounded. So I think we need to think a lot as in like the media community, which is kind of the one that I'm still vaguely attached to, even though I've defected into pseudo-academia. It's the one where my heart is still there, even though I'm doing something else every day. But we need to think about to what extent we can do that, because I think we can. We can't wait for the politicians to do it. So this comes down to stuff like debating shows. The way debating shows are constructed at the moment in America, they encourage a kind of reality show Punch and Judy contest, down to the micro rules. So the rules in an American TV debate are, if you attack someone, they have the right to attack you back. So both of you are interested in attacking each other as long as possible, you get more airtime. And that's the aim of everyone. It's kind of the logic that we'd use in a reality show. Be as scandalous and aggressive as possible, you'll get more airtime. And so surprise, surprise, the reality show master won because he's like, I know these rules. This is how you do reality shows. Say controversial things, attack people, you'll get more airtime. Easy. What about if we did it differently? What about if we set them a policy challenge and said, now show us how you're going to collaborate together to achieve it and collaborate with the other side. The rules change, the motivations change, the rewards change. That's a small example, but I think we need a lot, and that would force you into a factual kind of conversation. So I think we need to think about this all the time. Editors need to start thinking, okay, every time I make an editorial decision, how do I drive the content to encourage a more factually driven, deliberational response? Now that's very hard because it's much easier to do high peak emotion. It's much easier to do scandal. You know, the economy of likes and shares on social media responds well to that kind of self-scandalization and kind of affirming certain identities. So you're really rowing against, you know, a lot of things. It's very hard, but I don't see any other alternative from where I am in the media space. But it's going to be a lot of work. We have to understand audiences much better. We've got to understand we have to understand much more about the appeal of conspiracy theories, you know, because that's a huge rhetorical trope that's used by all these leaders as well. Instead of having ideologies and arguments, they describe the world in conspiracies. We have to understand why that works so well. We have to understand much more about how people process information and how they make sense of it. We haven't done that. I mean, we really haven't. The people who do think about this are the propagandists. So, you know, people doing political campaigns think about this a lot. And they do focus groups and they do analysis. And we're fighting people who think about audiences way more than we do. And that has to change. We have to really start understanding who we're competing against. We're competing against people who are better at us at media. And that's not, you know, that's really dangerous. They're not just doing political campaigns, they're doing storytelling. They're doing, like, you know, I don't want to credit Steve Bannon too much. I think he's a bit of a self-promoter. But this idea that politics is downstream from culture, that's what they're all thinking about. And that's who we're competing with.
So can you mention any specific examples on successful editorial policies goes against this scandal logic, and any good examples that others can follow in the media or in the civic space on how to go against this very strong driver of further polarization and more debates and so on?
So most of the experiments that I'm aware of are still kind of small and usually laboratorial and often sort of in universities, so they haven't been scaled. But there's been, I think, some work at the University of Texas, I think, looking at how you curate. So I know someone who's doing it. I don't know whether she's got all the results yet, but how you create dialogue, I think, kind of on the social media pages of the Houston, I can't remember, of a big Texas newspaper. And I think the whole idea is if you take away people's labels, if people don't know if the other person they're talking to is a Democrat or a Republican, that then improves their ability to have a dialogue. And the very interesting thing is, people talk about polarization all the time, but actually, in terms of major policies, I'm talking about Britain and America here, actually there's much more alignment than ever before. Sometimes the debate is captured by the extremes, like in the abortion debate or in the gun debate. But actually, if you look, I think Rand did a lot of work in America, and now King's College done a lot of work in England. It's this big paradox. Actually, when it comes to most things, civil rights, minority rights, even the economy, actually there's more cohesion than there's ever been before. You know, in the 60s, we had, I think, a genuine debate in America about, segregation or whatever, about civil rights. These are big, genuine ideological debates between left and right, now they're actually very little, but you have this incredible, what academics call affective polarization, so emotional polarization, which is completely out of balance with what people really think, with what people care about on issues. And I don't know if you've had this sort of feeling. I mean, I have, people I know in America who are very pro-Trump, and when we talk about Trump and stuff, it all gets very heated. If we talk very concretely, what do you think about gun policy? We agree very fast, or most things we actually agree very fast. But then, like, you're a liberal. It's like, what does that even mean? We've attached these weird labels. So there's something else going on, which isn't the actual policy debate. So I think that's the space to look into. In terms of other interesting pioneering experiments, work in Taiwan, actually, which was not so much about media. That was about how do you bring different stakeholders to have a conversation online that brings a consensus position. And there's been, I can forward you the details. A friend of mine at the BBC did a report on it. But essentially, instead of, it was like using social media in a way where it's constantly looking for the consensus positions between different groups and just bringing them closer and closer. And I think they came up with some policy decisions about, I can't remember, about transport or something, which was meant to be quite contested. So you have stuff like that. A lot of the most interesting strategies have been tried in post-conflict resolution and counter-extremism, where there has been an attempt to reach out to audiences who are very, very alienated, whether it's youth who are being captured by, Islamist narratives or in the aftermath of war. So actually, I think a lot of the most interesting thinking has been in those sort of spaces, where there's a conscious attempt to embrace the other side. I'm not saying we're in the same situation. This is not we're not actually in a post-conflict space. But I think that's where we could actually get a lot of our best ideas from. Apart from that, there aren't very many media who get up in the morning and think, how do I reach the other side? That's nobody's job. Everybody's job is the opposite. How do I fire up my side? What's been tragic in America is to see so many of the cable news channels deciding to be the non-Fox or the non-anti-Trump. I'm not saying their editorial standards are much higher than Fox, but in terms of strategy, that's what they do. No one gets up in the morning and goes, how do I reach the Fox viewer? They're doing the opposite. Like, how do I whip my guy up? In Britain, we have the BBC, which does think about this and has to think about it, but, it's very hard. And the BBC has that kind of running through all of it. But there's various reasons why I think they're struggling, or are struggling more than previously. But generally, I don't think it's anybody's job. I don't think any media manager gets up in the morning and says, okay, how do I go over there? Because it's always going to be, even the experiments we do, it's more viral to be polarizing. And most people either have to make money from clicks and shares, that's the ad tech that they're locked into, or, and here this is where I think about development much more, they've been told by foundations that they have to be independent and self-supporting within 2 years. And to be independent and self-supporting within 2 years, you go and fire up your side. So we're in a bad loop. Most of the experiments that I know are kind of in university sort of settings or tiny laboratories, like ours at the LSE. But there are others as well. So there's a long road ahead, which is why it's worrying, because these are systemic things. They don't come and go with a Putin or a Trump or an Orban. These are actually systemic things. No, there's been, and there have been other, so some media are starting to experiment. So Die Zeit in Germany did a whole series, but that was about curating conversations, about getting people who are on different sides of debates to meet, to talk online, to see the other's point of view. In Denmark, I've heard of some projects trying to reinvent debating formats, but largely in town hall settings. So look, there are people trying little things, but it has to be systemic, and it can't be kind of a special feature, which it often becomes. It's like, here's our little section that does bringing people together. It can't be like that. It actually has to be the core philosophy within, the nature of the media. And also, I think, within the nature of the social media. So I think we have to think about what is social media's role in this. So, for example, what is the responsibility of Google for when you, on YouTube, type in Syria? What responsibility do YouTube have to give you a nice, mixed selection of content that is biased towards accuracy? And that's a decision. That's a computer science decision to make. They can do it. It's not hard to do. It's a question of, can we in a society agree about how that's done? Who oversees that? At the moment, they do some stuff on their own and tell us that they're doing it, but there's no oversight and there's no real measurement of its effectiveness. So I think those are the kind of the structural questions we need to be asking. And for all the good experiments out there, they're still very niche things. Well, they should actually be, right in the center of the editorial strategy.
So probably we should end up today with this small spark of positivity. Thank you for being here today, Peter, and also for partaking in our event earlier this week. In case you missed it, you can find the stream of this event at Political Capital's Facebook site. You've been listening to a Political Capital podcast hosting Peter Pomerantsev from the London School of Economics and Péter Krekó from the Political Capital Institute. You heard Dorka Takácsy.